the difference between miraculous and providence. And we talked a little bit about how God has changed, based on the scriptures that we saw, God has changed the way he uses people, like the apostles and with the miraculous gifts that they had and those kind of things. But that doesn't necessarily change the fact that it doesn't change the fact that God's still working in the world and that he listens to his people, hears us. And whether you want to call it providence or miracles, he's still working, for his people. Otherwise, a lot of the scriptures that we read about prayer and those kind of things wouldn't serve any purpose. So that's kind of where we left off last week. I said that because we were behind, we didn't get a chance for any comments or questions. So I wanted to give opportunity to that before we dove into what I call the last section of Job here with God speaking then. So did anybody have anything that on that before we move on? All right, good then. All right, so we're going to move on to Job chapter 38. In chapters 38 through 41, God gives the longest speech he makes in the Bible. Now that doesn't count, if you count Jesus, of course, as God. As a man here on earth, there's lots of longer speeches in the Gospels, but as far as God speaking as God, I think that, and I could, maybe I'm wrong on this, I don't think I'm wrong, I think that this is the longest continuous place. Maybe back in Exodus where he does the 10 Commandments, that's a pretty long section too. Yeah, you can figure out which one's long. I think this is the longest one though. But anyway, either way, it's a long speech that God gives. I probably should have Googled it before I said that, shouldn't I have? But it's a long speech that God gives, and verse 1 says that God answers Job out of a whirlwind. And we talked a little bit about this. So I don't know if this whirlwind was approaching, and that's what led Elihu to start talking about the thunderstorm and the way God uses the thunderstorm, or if because of the discussion God just uses that to appear. But there's some reasons that he would appear out of a whirlwind. The main one being, as you look back to Exodus, God doesn't appear before people in his full form, right? Because what would happen? The glory of God would kill you, right? I mean, that's like you couldn't go before God. Moses saw God through a veil, and then he would be like bright colored, have a glow about him or whatever after he came back from talking to God. So of course he doesn't directly appear. He's appearing out of this whirlwind. Take a moment to imagine if you were there. Like we said, there's probably a group of people here, and all of a sudden you've been having this discussion, this debate amongst yourselves, and all of a sudden God starts talking out of this storm. It would be a pretty amazing thing to be present for, I would think.
You used the word amazing. I think more like terrifying.
Or terrifying too, yeah. It would be both, I would say. But the thing that we want to note as we discuss what God has to say here, earlier in Job we talked about how some people, in modern day have used, or at least at times, have used the book of Job as to point out scientific accuracies, how Job had knowledge of certain accuracies that wouldn't have been known in that time period. And we said that that's not really accurate because you see how many fallacies these people had as they were talking. So you don't really want to try to use what people say as far as proof of scientific accuracy. But however, when it comes to chapter 38 through 41, who's speaking? God is, right? So it better be accurate or else we got a problem. So I wouldn't say so much that what God has to say here proves, like, is like really relative, how do you say that? revealing speech like that, where he goes deep into stuff that that proves something, but he certainly doesn't say anything inaccurate that would make it so that, well, like whenever you look at writings from people, especially in certain time periods, you can go back and you can find where they said things because of the belief of the day that didn't make any sense, right? As we know now, like things that we found in the future. But in the Bible, when it comes to what God's saying, like I said, what people could say are erroneous things because people are people. Now, then what's been recorded was inspired, but what they were saying wasn't inspired, right? It's recording what their opinions. Like we've talked about how those opinions were wrong in a lot of cases. So they were wrong in a lot of things to say. So to try to use like some obscure scripture to say, oh, look what they knew that they shouldn't have known, it doesn't really make sense. But whenever it comes to God, we need to make sure that everything is accurate. So just as the scientific accuracy of the Bible is evidence of its inspiration, it would be used as an argument against inspiration if something can be proven to be inaccurate. And there's been a lot of those discussions. And we won't get too deep into that, but I do want to touch on it a little bit as we go through here. So I'll highlight some of the science truths that God discusses in his speech as we go. The book that I have been using quite a bit, there's both of these books here, but the one by Wayne Jackson has a chapter on science. So I kind of started that as a base point, but that was written in the early 1980s, and there's been a lot of changes in science and new discoveries since then. So I used that as a base and then Googled some stuff as well, looking at things. And also there's some information from Answers in Genesis. So we'll kind of do two things. We'll kind of have we'll talk about what God says here and also kind of do a Bible evidences, talk about science a little bit as we go through these chapters. And of course, if anyone has newer information or something that I got wrong, because I found some things like there were some contradictory things that I found as I was looking at different things. So like if anybody has more accuracy, feel free to share it as we go, as far anything that we have. But either way, I haven't heard of any discoveries that would throw into doubt the legitimacy of the Bible. Now, some people have tried to claim that they found things or like that, but I haven't ever seen anything or found anything that would do that. So kind of to introduce this section, I wanted to read one section out of the Holman commentary dealing with this chapter. So let me get there. I didn't have my marker there. That was another bad thing, I guess. Okay, so this is just his introduction to the section. So I'll just read his introduction to the section as well. Never before had a Senate hearing drawn the attention that the Clarence Thomas judiciary hearing drew. It started out innocently enough until the last-minute testimony of a woman by the name of Anita Hill. Instantly, the focus shifted to the moral turpitude of Judge Thomas. One of the highest judges in the land suddenly found himself accused of sexual harassment. The charge was serious. The judge was being condemned as a person unfit to sit on the bench. As the entire nation watched, the Senate Judiciary Committee sat presiding over the interrogation. Having been nominated to sit as a justice on the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court, Thomas was undergoing an unparalleled character assassination with unsubstantiated innuendos. This 11th hour attack threatened to ruin his life and career while preventing him from sitting on the bench of the Supreme Court. The issue was critical. Did Thomas possess the personal character necessary to sit in judgment of others? Thomas was eventually cleared of all wrongdoing and found to be competent to serve on the highest court in the land. The story of Job is one of high drama. Job had been accusing God, the judge of heaven and earth, of injustice and had demanded his day in court to present his case against God. Having charged God with being unfit to sit on his throne, the issue at stake was the judge's competency to rule the universe. Is God qualified to preside over all creation? That was the issue. The Creator had been charged with wrongdoing by one of his creatures and must defend his own glory and honor. But near the end of the proceedings, the case took an unexpected turn. Rather than God himself taking the witness stand as Job had hoped, God chose to put Job, the plaintiff, on the stand and examine him. No other witness was brought forward, no other evidence was submitted, no more cross-examination was needed. God himself was in control of this entire court scene. Job had asked for a hearing with God so he might present his case before him. He wanted God to present a bill of indictment with specific charges, which he believed himself to be adequately prepared to answer. But when Job got what he wanted, a day in court with God, he did not want what he got. God suddenly burst on the scene and spoke to Job out of a whirlwind, asking him over 70 questions. What follows is the longest conversation in the Bible in which God speaks. He says it's that's longest, okay. If you can learn about someone from his words, there is much for us to learn about God here. The theophany, or appearance of God, that Job had asked for finally arrived. So that's the way he sets the table for this discussion or speech that God gives kind of as an introduction to that. So what we're going to do here is read, I think we'll probably, I'm trying to debate, I guess we should probably just do the whole thing, do all Job chapter 38. We'll read it all, and then we'll kind of break it down and talk a little bit about it. So, Terry, are you reading, you want to do Job 38?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to read the top part of that. Hold on to it. Thank you, sir. No, that's nice.
Okay. God speaks now to Job. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkened counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you will instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? Or what were the bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstones? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who enclosed the sea with doors? When bursting forth it went out from the womb. When it made a cloud its garment, and thickness darkens its swaddling band, and I placed boundaries on it, and set a bolt and door. And I said, Thus far you shall come, but no farther. And he shall your proud waves stop. God's mighty power, have you ever in your life commanded the morning, or caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and they stand forth like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and the uplifted arms is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you understood the expanse of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Where is the way to the dwelling of light, and darkness where it is its place, that you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the paths of its home? You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of distress, for the day of war and battle? Where is the way of the light is divided, or the east wind scattered on the earth? Who has cleft a channel for the flood, or a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on the land without people, or a desert without a man in it, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the seeds of grass to sprout? Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew? From those womb has come the ice, and the frost of heaven, who has given it birth. Water becomes hard like stone, and the surface of the deep is imprisoned. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth a constellation in its season and guide the bear with her satellites? Do you know the ordinance of the heavens, or fix their rule over the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, so that an abundance of water will cover you? Can you send forth lightnings, that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the innermost being, or given understanding to the mind? Who can count the clouds by wisdom, or tip the water jars of the heavens? Then the dust hardens into a mass, and the clods stick together. Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? When they crouch in their dens and lie in wait in their lair. Who prepares for the raven its nourishment, when its young cry to God and wander about without food?
All right, yep, that one's a long one. Thanks, Terry, for reading that. All right, so in Job 38, God does what I would call a shock and awe campaign. You guys remember that term from a while back, a shock and awe campaign, by overwhelming Job with a display of his sovereign majesty. The series of questions he asks Job are meant to show how little people know about God's world. Now then, of course, you got to think about it. We know more about it now than they did. A lot more, actually, but definitely the point back then when they didn't know even as much as we know now was how little they know or understand about that. The questions basically emphasize two different propositions. Number one, God has sovereignty over the natural order of the universe. And number two, God has sovereignty over the moral order of the universe. So, because what had come into question was, of course, the moral justice of God, right? Like, he's allowing wicked people to get away with wickedness, and he's punishing the righteous for what they're doing and allowing them to suffer, was kind of the tone of what was being discussed. So those two things, are at issue here. In verses 1 through 3, God asks Job why he thinks he is qualified to call him into question. Like, who are you? Who is this that darkens my counsel? Instead of God, as was mentioned in the commentary, instead of God being the prosecutor and Job being the defendant, God's actually going to be the judge and the prosecutor, both. That's not fair. We are talking about how that's not fair for people, right? And that is kind of what Job was concerned about back earlier. Like, how can I even, no matter what I do, you're God. So Job had admitted that whenever he was requesting this kind of a court, and that's basically what happens, is that God's going to put him on the witness stand. Now, we already talked about it, but just once again to emphasize, why do you think, or if anybody has a different take on it, why do you think God spoke from the whirlwind? To some degree, I would think.
To show he has control over the elements.
Right? Any other reasons? Right, yeah, like what we talked about, I don't think that he could look directly at God, so it had to be out of something, right? Probably. That's kind of what I'm thinking anyway. Any other thoughts on that? All right, so then in verses 4 through 7, God begins to barrage Job with questions meant to clarify how little Job actually knows about what he had been talking about. Now then, if you remember back in verse 7 here, God mentions, he says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Now, if you don't remember, because it's been a very long time since we started our discussion on Job, but back in chapters 1 and 2, the devil comes to a meeting that God has with the sons of God. And we kind of talked about, well, what were the sons of God? Were they humans? What were they? Well, this would tend to say that it's angels, because there weren't people at the time of creation. He says the sons of God shouted for joy as God was creating the universe. So I think if you look at it that way, that might clarify a little bit about what was being discussed back in the beginning there.
How many sons of God are there?
I don't know that we have that answer. I know that it says, Jesus says that he could call legions of angels, right?
Are those sons of God? The legions of angels? Is that what we're...
That's what I would interpret using this, yes.
Okay.
Now then, there's other ways that term can be used, right? I mean, today, what do we call Christians? Or what were Israelites called? Children of God, right? So I mean, there's other ways that can be used, but I think here in this, I think that's what I think is the way it's being used. All right, so anyway, so God's barraging Job with these questions, and I wanted to read an article here. This is an interesting. I don't know. How many of you know who Ken Ham is? Several of you know. Okay, so there was an article that he wrote. I forget what date this was. I had it somewhere in here. This was back a while ago, though, where somebody had sent a question to I guess it would be the Answers in Genesis people. He said, it says, "Hi, folks. I understand you teach that the world was created in 6 days a few thousand years ago. I just have one question. Were you there?" So I think it's probably kind of a gotcha kind of question from that phraseology, but I'm not totally sure where the person was coming from. But the way he answers it, he says, "Thank you for sending us your question. The simple answer is no, we were not there, and we have never claimed to have been there. This question is based on one that God asked Job. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." By asking a series of rhetorical questions, God demonstrated that Job's knowledge was finite compared to God. Fallible humans know next to nothing. Job responded correctly when he stated the following, and we'll get to this eventually, but I know that you can do everything and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. When teaching children, we tell them they should politely ask the question, were you there? When talking to someone who believes in millions of years and molecules to man evolution. If someone replies by asking the same question as you have done, we say, no, we weren't there, but we know someone who was there. Someone who cannot lie, who knows everything and has always existed. And this one has revealed to us what happened in the past in his history book called the Bible. Are you interested in reading God's history book to find out what the word of one who was there tells us about the true history of the world? Really, the above simply illustrates the difference between historical and operational science. The word science primarily means knowledge. Operational science, based on our five senses, repeatable and observable, etc., has enabled man to build wonderful technology. Whether one is an evolutionist or creationist, Christian or atheist, we basically agree on operational science. The disagreement comes when considering historical science, knowledge concerning the past when we were not there. Recently, there was a high-profile murder trial in the USA. I don't know exactly which trial he's referring to, but I could probably guess. This trial highlighted the problem with historical science. The evidence presented by the prosecution was circumstantial evidence gathered in the present. Regardless of how much evidence they had, they could not absolutely prove or prove beyond a reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors what happened in the past. In fact, there have been cases where people have been found guilty of a crime based on circumstantial evidence, only to be found innocent later when more evidence, such as DNA evidence, came to light. The only way we can know for sure how the universe and life were formed is if an infallible eyewitness revealed to us what happened. Actually, that may be just a thing. It's highlighted. That might be just his point, because I don't think that's exactly how the article goes here. But the origins issue involves historical science. Certainly, operational science can be used in the investigation. For instance, scientists can observe bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics and even understand why this happens. In many instances, it is because of a loss of genetic information. Scientists can observe new species forming. However, such evidence in the present does not provide a mechanism for molecules to man evolution over millions of years. Evolutionists use such evidence from the present in an attempt to extrapolate back into history, claiming that the small changes they observe in the present ultimately lead to big changes needed for molecule to man evolution. However, creationists claim that such changes do not provide the creation of brand new genetic information, which is necessary for molecules to man evolution. The point is, here we go. The point is, the only way we can know for sure how the universe and life were formed is if an infallible eyewitness revealed to us what happened. The Bible claims to be the word of one who was there, who is infinite in knowledge and wisdom, and who has revealed in his written word an account of the history concerning our origins, so we can correctly understand the present since we have an inerrant record of the past. No, we were not there, but God was there and has always existed. His record of history concerning creation, the entrance of sin and death, the flood of Noah's days, the Tower of Babel, and so on, correctly explains the present. And evidence properly applied confirms the truth of this revelation. So I think it's a pretty good point there as far as whenever somebody says, well, how can you be sure, because you weren't there? It's all the way around, right? None of us, nobody was there. So the only way that you can know for sure is if somebody was there. We have one who claims to have been there. So the question is, do you believe that claim or not? It's certainly, whenever, as we talk through this, a lot of the things that people believe when it comes to evolution is totally based on just some, I don't even know what you would say. It's just based on somebody's guess as to what might have happened. They can't prove anything. Nobody was there. They're just making leaps.
Science doesn't even support evolution.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, there was once upon a time that they thought it did for a very brief period, right? But no, it doesn't. They've never been able to get where they thought they were going to go with it. So science, well, and especially in today's society, we know that following the science means one thing politically versus another thing in reality, right? So science can be used in a very bad way and to control people and things. So yeah, science is a whole topic to itself, really, as far as that goes. But the big point that I thought that I got out of Ken Ham's article was just talking about, nobody can say what happened from their perspective. We all think that we know all this stuff because we've learned these things and we see these things. And as I mentioned before, we only know what we know. Like we only have experienced a very limited thing. And then people are taking, and we'll talk about this more as we go through this stuff, but people are taking these little things that we've learned or that we see and applying it over things that we don't have the capability of understanding or knowing. We just can't. But when you take what, how many years of recorded history do we have weather-wise? Maybe 300, 400? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, and then they're trying to project all this stuff, like saying this is what's happening with the weather. Yeah, we don't know. There's no way we can know. Anyway, getting back into verses 4 through 7 here. God says, "Were you there when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Okay, so whenever God says, it's obvious what he means when he says who set its measurements. It means it has precise measurements, right? But when it says on what were its bases sunk, or who laid the cornerstone or its cornerstone, what do those kind of things mean? What does that mean in your mind? It's been built a certain way, right? And of course, I think in this case, he's talking about the ground on the earth. So if you go back to your science class, what were the inner parts of the earth called? Anybody remember? There's magma in the inner parts of the earth, but what's that in? That's in the core. Yeah, the core, mantle. Yep, mantle. And then the crust. Yeah, and there's actually, I think they've divided it now into a couple different parts of the mantle. Yeah, you got the inner core, the outer core, or I guess it's the core that has two different pieces. The outer core, the mantle, and the crust. Yeah, and part of the inner core is magma or molten rock. And in verse 4, he mentions that he laid the foundations of the earth. The word used in this verse is yasad, which refers to laying the foundation of a building, like what you were saying there. And in verse 6, he asks, on what were the earth's bases sunk? And the Hebrew word used there is Eden or Eden, which means socket. A socket had a peg inserted into it in order to secure the pegs, or the planks, excuse me. So it seems that God is referring to the bases of the land masses on the earth. And how they are sunk deep. Once again, this would coincide with what we've found now with the continents being attached to the mantle, which is deep, going deep down in to the earth, and the mantle is made of solid rock. So that kind of, there again, God didn't say exactly what all this meant as he was saying it, but what he said was definitely not inaccurate. About how this was created. Once again, just as a point of that, what shape is the earth? It's flat? All right, try again. What? Spherical, yeah. So what is a sphere? Circular, a three-dimensional circle, you might say. It's symmetrical, round in shape, a three-dimensional solid, has its surface points at equal distances from the center. In verse 5, God asks who set the earth's measurements, indicating that they were set with specific measurements for a specific purpose. And the earth is spherical, but it's not a perfect sphere. The earth's diameter at the equator is 7,926 miles, while it is only 7,899 miles at the poles. So why do you think that is? Any science gurus in here that know why that's the case? All right, so George McCready Price was a Canadian creationist in the mid-1900s, and of the shape of the earth, he said, the simple fact is that if the world were a perfect sphere, its rotation would pile up the waters of the ocean around the equator to an enormous extent, drawing them away from all the northern and southern parts. In short, the shape of our world shows design on the part of the one who created it and who adapted its size, form, density, etc., to its rotation and to all the other physical laws that now govern it. Now then, that's from a creationist viewpoint. What might somebody who doesn't believe God created it, what might they say caused that little difference that allows the earth to function the way it does? Just happenstance that happened?
Science explains it as the rotation as it
pulls it together. So they would say not the creator didn't create it that way. They would say that it happened that way because like it's the other way around, that just the way it happened led to that function. So that's a kind of a key thing to think about, right? That what we think of as God creating it that way, they would say just happened that way. Unicorns? We'll get to unicorns. Yeah, we'll get there. So that anyway, that's an interesting. It kind of depends on the way you're coming at it as to how you answer that question, right? So once again, not absolute proof, but certainly nothing said that would be incorrect from God's perspective, and a lot of implications of things that we now can see, right? Another interesting observation, now I know I talked about how the people who spoke in Job really can't be relied on for their scientific knowledge, but in Job 26:7, Job had said that God hangs the earth on nothing. And now if you compare that with this passage where God says, you know, it's on what were its bases sunk and who laid its cornerstone, you know, that's a pretty big difference, right? But I think Eric Luntz had an article called Contradictions Hanging on Pillar of Nothing. And he summarizes kind of what was happening here. He says, God hangs the earth on nothing. So in other words, there's no physical mass holding the earth up, right? But it's not just dangling in space. He has firmly fixed an orbit for our planet and upholds it securely in its proper place in our solar system. So what holds the earth in place? Gravity, right? So we see that so Job wasn't incorrect in saying that it's hung on nothing, but it is not dangling there on nothing, right? God put it in orbit around the sun. So, all right, well, anyway, does anybody have any other scientific tidbits to note there on that section before we go on to 8 through 11? All right, good then. We got just a couple of minutes. No, maybe not, I guess. Did you ring the bell already? All right, never mind. Now, I'm going to be gone for 3 weeks. I actually hoped to be done with Joe before I went on vacation. Clearly, we're not done yet. I think Jimmy's going to do a couple of classes, and I don't know, somebody else is going to do one of the classes, because I think Jimmy's not going to be here one of the weeks as well. But anyway, so we're going to have 3 weeks. We're going to take a break from Job. And when we come back, we'll pick up here in Job 38 and continue discussing what God had to say and some scientific gems or whatever you want to call it as we go through here. So, all right, thank you. And we'll be back in about 15 minutes for worship.